Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Building and Managing a Budget. My name is Kelly Blount, and I'm the Program Marketing Specialist here at General Electric Credit Union. We have a lot of great content ahead, and we're so glad you're here, and just wanted to thank you all for tuning in from wherever you are today, whether that's work or your couch. We're glad you're here, and we're excited to be able to share information on building, determining the best budget for you, and how to best manage that. Please note today's meeting is being recorded. By attending this webinar, your attendance is agreement to being included in our recorded session. Before we get started, I do like to go through a couple housekeeping items just to give everyone the rundown of the lay of the land and how today is going to work with our webinar. So if you've joined us, this will likely be a repeat of information, but if not, and you're new to our webinars, welcome. As we all know, technology can sometimes be finicky, so if we do run into any issues, please note we are recording today's webinar. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into it. To reduce background noise, just so you're aware, all attendees are automatically muted upon joining. Should you have any questions, you can go ahead and use the questions feature in your attendee panel to submit your question. It'll come directly to me, to where I'll save it for our Q&A session at the end. Additionally, if you have any issues with your technology, you can use the same feature, and I will help you navigate that to get back into working order. If you're on a computer or smartphone, that drop-down is going to be located in the lower right corner. And for the sake of time during our Q&A session, we may not be able to answer every question, but we will reach out to you after to ensure that question does get answered should we not be able to get to it during that designated time today. Additionally, after today's webinar, you will receive a pop-up that takes you to a survey. We are doing our best to continue to read your responses and work to make your suggestions to continue our webinar program and make it better, and look for times and days that you're wanting for webinars. So please take a quick moment to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared to our events page in the coming week. You'll be able to take a look back at this webinar as well as any other webinars on demand through our events and YouTube page. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Todd Moore, the Director of Education with Trinity Debt Management, to introduce himself and take us through today's content.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. And thank you so much for joining us in our webinar series. Today, getting into the topic of budgeting once again, a fundamental and important part of your personal finances. Got a lot of great content today for you. Going to introduce some concepts from behavioral economics and just try to take a fresh view of budgeting here this morning, kind of get you to think about how you approach this topic a little differently. So wanted to start our discussion this morning by looking at our current economy and some of the challenges that we're currently having. I think we all feel kind of the challenges of inflation. And I thought what I would do to kind of get us thinking about how we approach this topic and just kind of run through the context here for a moment, give you some of the research that I've found in just preparing for this morning's discussion. So I think, again, one of the big factors that comes out of our research, you certainly don't need me to tell you this, we're living it now, you know, skyrocketing inflation. That's been one when we look at whether it's the economic literature that's put out by the Fed, just across the board. We all feel it in our everyday lives. So this topic, very timely and very important. We also know from a lot of the literature and from many of the surveys, economic surveys that I've been reading, and just trying to get a good read on the trends. Are we heading out of inflation? Where are we at this point? I think that we all know that most literature all points in one direction. We're carrying more credit card debt and than we've had for many, many years. And I've shared this statistic in a couple of different presentations, but it's worth noting again. In addition, we see emergency savings, again, very low. We're just using our cash to kind of get us through this inflationary period. So we see that folks are struggling with their credit card payments. We're battling interest rates. If we look at some of the measures in terms of delinquency rates, certainly see that, whether it's 30, 60, 90 days past due, those in the fourth quarter, we started to see those rates shoot up. I think they're probably holding steady at that rate now. And one that we're all kind of struggling with right now is food costs and just necessities. Thought this was an interesting number. So if we look back 2 years ago, on average, and I think I pulled this one from Federal Reserve of St. Louis, kind of did some research nationally on this statistic. But here's where you see that 2 years ago, $784 on average per month compared to what we would have paid 2 years ago. And then going back 3 years ago, we see it's over $1,000. Actually, this was Moody Analytics, but similar results, whether we're looking at the Fed or Moody Analytics. Food cost necessities, again, one of those indicators of inflation. So I also looked at, and there are many different variations on this, but I looked at the Bankrate Emergency Savings survey from this earlier this year. I think it was put out in January. So wanted to highlight a couple of those numbers with you now. If we look back, we see that 2 in 3 consumers, again, are saving less. Again, inflation continues to impact savings rates. When we look at some type of hardship, they asked the question, if you were faced with $1,000, some type of emergency, what would happen? More than half of consumers would say they didn't have enough in their emergency savings to meet that $1,000. So this is where you start to see folks using more and more of their credit cards, open balances on credit cards as a way to, move themselves through this inflationary period. Then you also can see where we've gotten overextended to the point where folks do have, we're starting to see our delinquency rates rise. Again, this interconnection all tying back to inflation. And then I wanted to point out a couple here for, thinking broadly about our budget. And I've seen this in several other surveys as well, the decline in retirement preparedness. So when we think about, part of our budgeting, part of the budgeting process, we want to take a broad view. And here's where we find that folks are they're saving less for retirement, again, trying to get themselves through inflation. And then when we look at investing as well, folks are much more conservative, not putting as much into the financial plan, maybe as they anticipated, trying to meet expenses, food expenses, other expenses, debts, just to move through inflation. So we know this context is challenging, and we know we need to do the work. So if we know budgeting is important, why doesn't it work? Now, I just want you to pause and think about this for a moment, okay? I mean, time and time again, we talk about the topic of budgeting, why we think it's important, the economic context. And then oftentimes, and I'm having a little fun with this question, but I don't want to overstate or imply that it doesn't work. Budgeting definitely can work, and it does work, and that's why we're here today. But there are a number of reasons why it may not be working for you, and why it may not be working for you at this time. And that's really what I'm hoping that the folks on the call today can kind of think about. A lot of literature around this topic, this only scratches the surface when we think about the effectiveness of budgeting or the outcomes of budgeting. Why not that it may not be producing the outcomes that it truly can produce for you? Because the bottom line is, without having this piece in place, without a budget, it's absolutely the case that we're not going to achieve the financial outcomes that we want. So when we think about why it doesn't work, what factors there really are at play? What's keeping you from not fully realizing the benefits from budgeting? So one of these, not having a financial plan. This comes from the idea that you have a plan, but it's not truly a financial plan. We don't really have, we don't have it laid out in a way where we have set things in motion through our budget. We don't have dollar amounts. We don't have alignment. Maybe that plan's not really been looked at for a while. It's kind of inconsistent. So not having a true financial plan, this is where budgeting is going to become part of our process to improve outcomes. So despite inflation, despite some of these other challenges in the economy, we want to take a broad view and make certain that we're working through the budgetary process in a way that continues to allow us to meet some elements measurably of having that financial plan in place. Second, when we think about unrealistic expectations, and this is a big one, you'll see this throughout the presentation. This is overestimating savings goals, debt repayment, kind of, the sky is always sunny, the blue skies and sunny days are here forever. Sometimes we trick ourselves. We overestimate how good things will be. So whether it's among, some of the items that I have here, whether it's a savings goal or debt repayment, or just how we think about risks that can come with employment or other things that could potentially come through the economy, there's a tendency to be unrealistic. We want to correct that unrealistic expectation. The inability to maintain a budget. Now here what we're looking at is through time, rather than things being aligned through time where we take a stepwise approach. In one of our previous budgeting presentations, I presented kind of the life cycle model. And here where maybe that model is not, it's broken in different ways for a number of different things that can happen along the journey of life and through employment or the economy. But we can also take steps that maybe we create a hardship for ourselves, just not maintain that. We get overextended and we underestimate how much it will actually cost us to maintain our desired lifestyle. And that was kind of a theme that we talked about in one of our previous budgeting presentations. I encourage you to go back and maybe give that one a listen. But the inability to maintain that budget by making trade-offs that will fail to produce, again, how we will make these trade-offs in a way that will not produce results for us long term. And then lastly, emotional spending, which is a very difficult behavior to correct in many ways. And I'll be talking about that today, but allowing our emotions to influence personal finances. And here's where we see a whole range of things that can come out of this theme, but particularly the outcome generally is that we're overspending or we have excessive borrowing. So those are some of the reasons or some of the ways that we can get off track or really fail to realize the fullest potential of budgeting and what that means for us. So I want to introduce to you now some economic, behavioral economic themes and really encourage you to kind of think about this before you get to the point where we're putting numbers down on paper. This is kind of educating ourselves a little bit about these themes, and just want to introduce this concept to you, have you think about this as you start down the path, putting together a budget. I think this will do you a lot of good. And again, the importance here is to kind of correct some of the behavior. Today's all about changing behavior, okay? So behavioral economics, what is it? So behavioral economics studies the psychological, emotional, cognitive, cultural, and social factors that influence our decisions. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're looking at that underlying behavior, our thought process, what drives us to make decisions. That's really what this is intended to do. And then we can look at how we have a bias towards certain things or how we make decisions, the idea of rational, or how we talk ourselves into what may be perceived as rational as we make financial choices. So when we think about this topic, it's very, very important for budgeting. It's very important for me when I'm working through clients here at Trinity. I'm always kind of thinking about this because I'm always trying to analyze, how does that particular person approach money? How do they think about money? What are their assumptions that they make? What's driving that fundamental behavior? And that's what I want to encourage you to think about today as we move our way through the presentation. So how do you approach this? How do you apply this to your own financial decision making? Okay. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create better money habits. And this is where you need to know, and I'm calling this your money personality. Okay. How do you approach this? What are your influences? How does any number of things get you to spend or to avoid spending? What is it that we need to tap into to change behavior? So are you a money avoidance type? Are you a money status type? Do you ignore your finances, or do you make decisions around your finances that will create perhaps emotional spending? Or do you think about status? Are you more a planner and you need some additional work to really align your budget differently? find a way to kind of equate net worth to self-worth. How do we get into these kind of two kind of fundamental categories? And that's really the journey that we're going to take, is trying to figure out, and I'm encouraging you to do, is try to figure out where do you fit, and then how do we correct behavior, okay, as we set up our budget. Now, first thing I wanted us to look at was spending decisions, okay? Again, applying this behavioral economic model to our spending decisions. Big part of our budget is going to have to do with our overall expenses. And, you know, that has a lot to do with the decisions that we make. Our spending decisions drive our expenses. So what does behavioral economics tell us? And I think this is fascinating. So what we look at here is what they call the effect, okay? How does it make you feel? Okay, very much in that emotional spending, but all of us have some reaction to money. So we can break this into anticipated or anticipatory behavior. Now, when we think about anticipated, here a way to think about this simply would be you anticipate something, some type of emotional reaction from that item or travel or whatever it may be. There's some anticipated value that you get from that spending decision. You place value on that spending decision. So for someone who has anticipated emotions, this is where we find that in this particular case, this can be someone who rushes into making decisions, okay? Anticipatory emotions tend to place someone where you're constantly kind of ruminating on whether or not you should spend the money, okay? So you approach it differently. I certainly fall into that anticipatory category. I will think it through. I keep thinking about whether I should or should not. And there's strengths and weaknesses to this, obviously, because when you're anticipating something, well, you can quickly rush in to make decisions. And whether you decide to do something that will create maybe a negative outcome for you, you overspend. There are times when maybe you took advantage of something that actually saved you money. Whereas an anticipatory thinker starts to go and ruminate on something to the point where they've kind of talked themselves out of something that may have actually produced value. And I'll show you a couple examples of this. But it does make a difference in terms of how you approach your budgeting method and the outcomes that you'll achieve from budgeting. So we're going to place this into two different categories, what we call spendthrifts and tightwads. Certainly we've all heard these terms before, but there is a lot in behavioral economics that goes around this concept. So really what we're talking about are the consequences of gains and losses, how we anticipate kind of gains and losses. So spendthrifts, they'll think about, you know, they ignore the costs, so they're kind of free on their purchases. They make them kind of quickly, but it's that impact, that what we call hedonic, or that feeling, that pleasurable impact that comes, but it's fleeting. You know, you go out and buy something, you spend a lot of money on it, and maybe there's that emotional attachment to that, and you anticipated that. So when you finally made that choice, there was an emotion that you received from that. You felt good about doing it, but it's fleeting. And then tightwads, they'll focus on the losses. They don't really want to spend the money, but there are instances where within that trade-off or that opportunity cost, you know, something that could have actually yielded some significant result. So a good example of this might be, you know, we're picking on the spendthrifts right now, saying that they're making too many choices and it's too fleeting and they're wasting money perhaps, whereas we tend to assume that tightwads are going to do better. They will do better in terms of savings and their spending decisions. But then in terms of budgeting, we also have to think about going again to that anticipatory concept. If we're just ruminating, then we may miss an opportunity. Okay, so it's finding that correct balance. That's really what we're talking about. There's always going to be tension, you know, between this concept. If you identify more on that spendthrift side, there's some work for you to do. And if you're a tightwad or looking at that opportunity cost, I would encourage you to look broadly. Maybe there's parts of your budget that you're not approaching because you're just too focused on one particular area. And this will come into focus a little bit more as we move through the presentation. But again, getting you to think about these concepts before you sit down and start putting numbers to your overall budget. How do you approach money, and what are some of your assumptions about money as you do the work? So best way I thought for us to do this, rather than just the theoretical, is let me give you some examples on this, and let's see if we can make sense of this, kind of put this into practice. So the first example that I wanted to give you, and in each case, we're gonna pose a question, and then we're gonna try to answer a question with some behavioral economic principle, okay? So the first question, if people say they wanna save for the future, why don't they? Why don't they do it? So in this case, what we're looking at is the concept of what we call hyperbolic discounting, okay? People put an unrealistically high value on the here and now, and an unrealistically low value on the future, okay? So basically what we're talking about here, again, applying this concept, if you're thinking, this is that area where, let's say that we make impulsive purchases, something, we find something that we perceive as a good deal, or we want to make some impulsive purchase that we think it will satisfy the present. The idea is that by doing that, we're overstating how wonderful things will be in the future. Okay, as we say here, for better or worse, people are willing to doom their future selves to more difficult than necessary circumstances. Okay, well, and in this particular case, the problem with this approach is that we discount what potentially may happen in the future, the cost, the challenges, the risk of things that can, again, economically or employment, health, a number of different things. But we discount those things for the immediate, the impulsive moment. So that's where as we're approaching our budget, we want to be aware of that concept. Keep that in mind as we're kind of structuring our budget, because this has a lot to do with your money personality, how you approach the topic. But one of the big ones that we see, hyperbolic discounting. Kind of think about that concept. And again, the idea is to correct that behavior so that we're more focused on our overall finances moving forward. The next one, lack of self-control. And I'll pose the question again. Why can't people do what they say they want to do? Here, let's think about rationality for a moment. If we're entirely rational, well, we would say it's very linear. We'll make decision A, B, C, D. It leads to our conclusion, okay? It's very rational. Well, most of us don't do that. The reality is, despite our best intentions, we give in to temptations, or we lack self-control. So it's that tension between what's good for us in the long term and what feels good right now. The good news here is that we can commit to a goal. And this is where budgeting is incredibly important, okay? And you'll see, again, as I present different types of budgets to you, one of the reasons we always come back to this idea of a goal is that if we find ourselves where that lack of control, or maybe, we're not able to stay consistent, having something built in and aligned to a budget that is goal-oriented, and you'll see this very clearly here soon, that's a way to kind of correct this type of behavior. Next is what we call tunneling. The question here is, why can't people plan enough to prevent the emergencies they encounter? Okay, so we all know that we got a number of emergencies. So why don't we do it? Why don't we plan for the future? So one way of answering this is called tunneling. If it's an emergency, we can only think about the emergency. If you're under a lot of stress or in a crisis, under a deadline, we put all of our focus on something that it's hand, and we neglect everything else that's going on around us. Now, how does this connect to budgeting? So think about it like this. I'm dealing with folks here at Trinity who are overextended on their credit, or have had a hardship, or just really have gotten themselves into debt for whatever reason, okay? Oftentimes, they may perhaps tunnel or only look at the crisis of their overall debt level. And then in terms of budgeting, where this is important, is maybe you're entirely focused on certain debts. And then even incrementally, if you could contribute more to your 401k or something else, you fail to do it at all. You're only focused on one part of the bigger picture. So for budgeting purposes, this is an incredibly important principle, because tunneling can get in the way of a lot of outcomes. So we want to make certain that as you plan, we don't want to get so focused or tunnel only on one item and then neglect to see the bigger picture. Next is the planning fallacy. So why do people repeatedly set unrealistic goals and expectations? So planning fallacy is one way that we might tend to approach this. Here, what we're looking at is people tend to be too optimistic about their future plans, even when previous plans didn't work out. Okay, again, this is that concept where we make plans based on unrealistic or best case scenarios. So similar to that hyperbolic discounting principle, where basically we think things are going to be great in the future, that there's not going to be as many problems. So we fail to account for unexpected expenses, even when they've occurred in maybe previous months. We just tend to overstate how good things will be. So that's a planning fallacy. So as we get into this work again, this is that notion of, making certain that we set clear, measurable goals and that we avoid being overly optimistic or, falling into the planning fallacy where we're not accounting for what may come. And the last example that I'll give you as we work through some of these examples is what we call mental accounting. So the question here is, why don't people treat all dollars equally? Now, this is a really interesting concept. So basically what it says is people categorize and treat money differently depending on where it came from and where it's going. So a couple ways to think about this is that, in this example, we've got a $10 theater ticket. And, $10, do we treat that $10 as $10, or does the context or how we mentally account for that $10 change how we value that money? So one way of thinking about this, within a budget, you have a whole bucket of funds that potentially could come out of this. We have investments, we have insurance, we have debt reduction, we have emergency savings, we got all sorts of things. Well, if, I'm going to avoid the $10 here for a moment. Let's just say that, it's $100 or $200. What do? Why don't we treat it equally? How do we go about money as money, or how do we account for it in our own minds? Often we will make choices on what we value. So practical concept is, again, you may believe that you want to use money in one way to pay off debts, and as you're working your way through that process, you really don't find a whole lot of value of contributing to your 401k. So the money that you could spend is kind of accounted differently in your own mind. You've got a bias in terms of what value you get overall for how much you're spending. So we account for that cash in different ways. The bias here, what it causes us to do, again, is overlook what needs to be done in a broader financial plan. So that's that concept of mental accounting. Just be aware of that. So that's a lot of theory. Hopefully you've gotten some good stuff out of that. It's a great kind of segue into this next segment here. It gets us down into the practical elements of our budget. But I really hope that you can apply some of those concepts and be aware of some of those things that can go wrong in our own kind of thinking as we're setting up a budget. But now it's time to get started. Now we got to put this thing into practice. We've got to actually design and create this budget so that it works for you. I know that most of us are going to have any number of different financial goals. Again, the concepts I laid out hopefully will keep you on track to avoid those types of biases that will get in your way as you're doing the work. But one of the first things we want to do as we're setting up a budget, obviously we're going to look at your income and we're going to look at monthly expenses. This is a big part of any budget. So having these numbers and doing this is where we want to take all of the income, kind of evaluate where you're at now, identify those fixed and variable expenses. We need to do some work up front to kind of get a good read on where we're at, particularly when it comes to finding out these overall expenses. There's a lot of ways you can get into those details. I would encourage you to use your account through the credit union. So you go in there and you start to do some digging. Fixed expenses, those things that are the same each month. The variable expenses has everything to do with behavior. That's those theories that we laid out earlier. that behavioral economic model that I told you about in the last previous slides, you really start to see whether it's emotional spending or mental accounting, tunneling, all that's going to be in those variable expenses because we make choices about how we spend. Our spending decisions are driven by behavior. So use your account to kind of do some work, get a good read on what those variable expenses are. Go into the account, kind of look for patterns. What are you spending the majority of your money on in terms of variable expenses? And then what we're going to look at here just generally is, again, we're always looking at that difference between our income and expenses. If those numbers are running negative, then we've got to go in and make a number of trade-offs, figure out what we're doing. But in the broader picture, when we're setting up our financial plan, this is where when we have some type of discretionary or some other type of money left over, what do we do with it? And again, mental accounting is where I would challenge you to think about some of your choices. What are you valuing when we find that additional money? How do we approach what we value? And are you making a broad plan that will, again, keep you from discounting the items that you should either invest in or maybe improve through the budgeting process? And then lastly, we're looking at, I'm going to encourage you to track your expenses. We're going to talk a lot more about tracking, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly now, but there are a number of ways to do this, and I'll show you that in the coming slides. But this is also, in addition to the budget that you will set up, tracking is an incredibly important part of your overall process. And I would even say that if you're not tracking, you're not truly budgeting, because while you've got your fixed and variable expenses, those things, if you really want to get a good read on what you're doing for variable expenses, tracking is what's going to show the broadest reach of behavior. That's the cash expenses, things that you're out with the kids, whatever you're doing. By tracking that, you're going to find the additional money that you need to address larger discrepancies where maybe you're undervaluing certain things in your budget or to pay off debts, whole range of things. But by not tracking, you're really not putting the pieces or aligning the pieces that will make you successful. So again, now we're back to this point where we're going to start talking about your financial plan again. So I'm thinking kind of a broad view here. We're just going to kind of break this into your short, medium, or long-term goals. These are goals within the next 5 years. What are they? Where do you want to go in the next 5 years? And then you're going to have to kind of think broadly about things that are 10 years or more, in the future. And again, where you're at in the life cycle or age, or work, etc., is going to shift where we're at through these measurable goals. But you need to have specific dollar amounts and a target date to really do this work. That's when we have a financial plan. We have money behind the idea, and we have a targeted outcome that we're moving towards. And that's what's going to give you the motivation to really do this work. Okay, so I encourage you to start to think about, when you sit down and look at your overall budget and you look at your income and your expenses, start diving into those numbers. This is where you really need to start thinking, okay, what is missing in this financial plan? Am I undervaluing putting money in my 401k or some type of retirement account? Am I not planning for my insurance needs? Am I not truly budgeting, just meeting my overall expenses? Figure out what that is. You need to know, why you're doing the work, and then apply that behavioral economic tool that I showed you earlier. If I'm not doing this work correctly, what's getting in the way? What type of mental process am I running through that's keeping me from reaching these larger goals? Now, when we think about budgeting methods, we really want to find something that's unique to you. Okay, that's why I say you need to know, your money personality. What motivates you? What is something that's aligned towards your personal preferences? So there's not a one size fits all in terms of a budgeting method. So you're going to have certain spending habits, you're going to have pay cycle, you're going to have certain preferences. Some of us are old school, some of us want technology, some of you want to do it pen and paper. There's all sorts of ways to get to a certain outcome, okay? So this is where it's unique to you. But in addition to just those types of preferences, there's also some various budgeting methods, and I'll show you some of those now. I'm not going to go into great detail on each one of these, not only for the sake of time, but because I have presented some of these before, but it is important, at least for those who are new with us today, or just to reiterate these approaches. I've got basically four variations on the theme. Okay, we got four different budgets here to talk about. Each one of these are a little different. They have strengths and weaknesses, but at the end of the day, you have to find one that you feel most connected to. Okay, doing budgeting is a very applied exercise. You have to commit and you have to be engaged in the work. So 50, 30, 20, the way we structure this, 50% of our income is in our required expenses, 20% is automatically put into savings, and then we have this 30% of discretionary income that we get to choose how we want to spend that money. It's ours to do what we want. But this is for someone who is just kind of setting a budget in motion, kind of new to this. You want structured rules for your spending. Again, this is a good start to get you focused on budgeting. And this is for someone who just really is not interested in all the fine details at this point. It's just trying to shift behavior. I just want to get into the practice of budgeting and get this thing started. So this would be a great approach for someone who's newer to budgeting or wants some type of structure that will help them become disciplined. Okay. Money flow is a little different. This is where we say, it's an automated approach. This, again, with your income, we're looking for you to have consistency. You've been budgeting for a while. Now you've got very specific goals you want to focus on. You've thought about some of those behavioral concepts. Maybe you've been tunneling for too long, focused only on certain crises. Now it's time to kind of broaden your understanding. Maybe you want to set something in motion, like an emergency savings, for instance. Okay, and you say, well, I've been budget constrained. I don't have that much cash. What am I supposed to do? Well, we're gonna set something in motion through automation where it's pulled into a separate account. And we're going to do this in a very slow incremental process. Okay, so what you can do here, rather than, again, tunneling or going through mental accounting of something like that, where you're kind of not, you're putting money and placing value in different ways, use this approach. Okay, we have our overall monthly expenses. We know what they are. But now we've aligned a couple goals. For instance, we might want to have emergency savings fund. We want some additional money for a down payment for a home. Okay, here we treat it as a predictable expense. We set it in motion through our budget. It's automatically put into one of our accounts, the credit union. Things are put into motion. It's part of our overall expenses, and we just leave it alone. It's pulled automatically. We build the account through time. Okay. But this approach is for someone who's been budgeting for a while and is consistent in their income with a measurable goal. This particular approach, again, another minimalist approach. We want to make certain that we meet, it's just spending by priority. Our fixed expenses, that's always going to be the top priority. Our savings goal is going to be a priority. This is extremely minimal because what it says is if those two priorities are met, then the rest of this will just kind of pay as we go. So we're just making choices with the cash we have left. Notice there's not even a percentage listed here. So here it's just basically trying to get you to start somewhere. Okay, but I would hope and encourage you that we get beyond this particular approach, because the better aligned to our goals, the more outcomes we'll get long term, and the more aligned it will be to our overall broader financial plan. And then lastly, for those on the call that are really focused on budgeting and say, you know what, it's time to get serious. I've neglected my retirement. I've neglected other elements of my insurance planning. I've neglected even, or someone may say, okay, I've really at this point focused so much on debt reduction that it's time for me to shift in my budget. I got to have some additional down payment assistance money or something. Zero sum budgeting. Every dollar has a destination. Okay. So in this particular case, income minus expenses equals zero. There's not a lot of quibbling over what to do. Everything, you've got a plan. You're going to set that plan in motion with the income that you have. Every dollar is accounted for. So those are four fundamental approaches that you can take to kind of think about your budgeting. And as you're doing this work, you might think about also calculating. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of calculate your debt to income ratio. I'm certain that we have folks that are interested in borrowing and their credit capacity. Good time while we're doing budgeting would be to think about our debt to income ratio. First thing that we want to do is we want to calculate over our monthly, our income, okay, before taxes or gross. And then we want to add up all of our monthly debt payments, everything that we have, okay? You'll find this ratio as well in the housing area. So if we have folks that are first-time home buyers and you're budgeting and you want to become a first-time home buyer and interested in talking to the credit union about a loan, we want to focus on our debt to income ratio at this point, in addition to our credit score. So what we do here to calculate this, your monthly debt payments divided by your gross income. Okay, so here what we have, I just gave a simple example here. It was just $2,600 in overall expenses divided by our income. We have 47%. So what does that really mean with this 47% debt to income ratio? I laid out a couple indicators here of risk because that's really what we're talking about. In addition to your credit capacity, you're looking at your expenses, want to be a borrower here soon for a larger dollar amount loan, want to budget around this area and think about this concept. And these are kind of broad because they're going to be specific to loan types. And so if you have questions about what is a good ratio, I want to encourage you to call and speak with one of the loan officers at General Electric Credit Union, kind of get into those details. But broadly, 35% or less, all the way through a range of 50%. And that previous example, at 47%, it's time to take action, okay? And this would limit your capacity and limit your borrowing ability because you're more or less, your debt to income ratio is just too high. For conventional loans, it's going to be somewhere in that 36% range, maybe a little bit higher, okay, depending on income as well. But, if you're looking at a whole range of housing values and just looking at your debt to income ratio, somewhere in that 36% range would be ideal. But this gives you a good, again, just pick up the phone, talk to one of the loan officers at the credit union, and we'll get into that type of detail. But while you're doing the work, calculate your debt to income ratio because it's going to say a lot about your borrowing capacity. So in these next few slides, I'm just going to introduce to you quickly just some ways to get into tracking your expenses. Again, this is something that I want you to think about for how you approach your personal finances. It has to be unique to you. There's a number of different tracking methods, as I said, as there is a number of different budgeting methods. So worksheets, spreadsheets, budgeting apps. I'll show you the General Electric Credit Union money management tool as well. The key is that you're engaged in the process. But what we're doing through budgeting, or what we're doing through tracking, is trying to, again, analyze and categorize our overall spending patterns and looking to categorize maybe what may not be tracked through our budget, our fixed and variable expenses. We spend a lot of money outside of what we assume is being budgeted in that process. So tracking, a good way to do this is you really want to look at least, I would say, a couple months. One way you can do this is go into your overall account through the credit union, start to categorize expenses. How much in entertainment or groceries or there's a whole range of things that we do, but we want to place numbers into categories. So it could be entertainment, it could be dining out, it could be things that you do for the kids, a whole range of things. The idea is what type of patterns emerge? And then you want to ask yourself, where am I overspending? Shifting that behavior again. I've talked about the money management tool. I'll introduce that to you here in a moment. But basically, I always try to put a plug in here for the money management tool. It's available to you. You can do a lot with this, but you have all of your spending behavior right there in your account using, if you're banking with the credit union, everything in your transaction history is already available. We just got to go pull those numbers out and make sense of them. Then also you can use the money management tool online to kind of get into your accounts, align certain things, set reminders. So I just want to encourage you, if you're not using the tool, give it a shot. At least take a look, ask some questions about it. I think that it can do a lot to align your finances and help you become better at budgeting. So with tracking expenses, bottom line, why does it really matter? So when we're doing this work, again, one of the key things I'm trying to emphasize here is shifting behavior, changing behavior, getting away from those mental blocks or mental shortcuts that we make, those economic principles that we talked about earlier. But tracking also has a lot to do about accountability and self-control. You know, we talked earlier, why do budgets often fail? Lack of self-control. So here's where tracking your expenses can shift that behavior and make you more successful. So when you're tracking through time, you know, what we're doing is we're able to see, we're able to make trade-offs. You know, maybe I was spending too much in one particular category. Maybe it's entertainment, maybe it's groceries, maybe it's things I'm doing with the kids, all sorts of different things that can be there. But by tracking and monitoring that through time, I become more aware. I begin to think about the costs, the benefits. I have more self-control. Secondly, we're talking about actually achieving financial results. So the more you're tracking, the more that you're in the act of doing this work, where you're monitoring your finances and reviewing things through time, it's much better to keep you motivated and keep you aligned to your overall goals. Okay, it's really about achieving some type of financial goal. And I looked at some of the research on this as well, you know, and the research would basically say this: research shows the more engagement, the better the outcomes. Okay, and there's a lot of literature out there, but basically think about it like this: the more you're practicing this, the better you get at it, the better the outcome. So the better for you to shift your spending behavior, more alignment within your personal finances. And then lastly, the positive feedback you get. You know, when you start to see some progress towards your financial goals, that's when this work really becomes fun. Get to see whether it's debt reduction, whether it's more money in your, you know, you open a financial statement, all of a sudden you've recognized that your 401k or your retirement's gone up. That's the reinforcement. That's the good stuff. That's what we want to see. And this is by just making that simple step to track your expenses. For some of us, we may want to have a starting point, so I'm going to give you one. You know, through the credit union, you can always set up a separate account, automate the process. We talked about automation in one of our previous slides. The budget that I presented will allow you to do that. Set up a separate account. This is that separate savings account where you can automate that process, treat it as an treat this emergency savings fund as a predictable expense in your budget. Start small. Doesn't have to be a large dollar amount. We're all credit constrained. We're all, you know, suffering with inflation right now. So just, you know, start small. $20, $25. Start somewhere, but automate the process. Let's get some money into this account. You can do it in another way. You know, you can also do it through payroll. You can do this through having it automatically pulled, making it, you know, or you could even go through and just make a larger contribution to your 401k. I always put this plug out there, but I want to say it again. When I'm out doing work in the community, one of the areas that is consistently undervalued, probably due to mental accounting, is that that same money that would help us, we account for it differently. So that $25 that we could put weekly into our 401k, we account for it differently. And then long term, we have less in our retirement simply because of a mental shortcut that we continue to make, a bias that we need to get around. I'm going to encourage you to look at that and think about that challenge in mental accounting and put more money into your emergency savings or some type of retirement or investment so you can have a stronger financial plan. And then some of you may want to think about reducing your credit utilization, improving your credit. You know, the credit union, we're always interested in trying to improve credit capacity in our community. We do presentations regularly on this topic. I love the topic and really proud to work with GE on this particular question, but budgeting is going to play a key part in helping you align funds to reduce your overall debts. So we want to shift that credit utilization, keeping it low. Start at this point through the budgeting process where we're going to start to bring down some of those credit card balances, shift that credit debt ratio, raise that score, work as well on our debt to income ratio, which these two pieces fit nicely together. If you're doing one, you're doing the other. So this is a great goal. So as you're working through this particular process through your budgeting, kind of accelerating loan repayment, this is going to help you reduce debts, but it's also going to shift and have a better debt to income ratio as well. So it's a nice way to have efficiency built into your budget. So we've gone through a whole range of options for you. And we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to run through a couple more slides here, and then I'm going to open things up for questions. But again, having a measurable starting point and thinking broadly about, your overall expenses, where you want to go, thinking broadly about your financial plan, figuring out what type of budgeting method is best for you. So last thing that I would approach is one area broadly undervalued is when we start looking at insurance. The credit union has partners that will help you with this as well. Life insurance, I work with families all the time that just undervalue life insurance, particularly a term plan, young families, folks who are new home buyers. They may have some type of employer-based plan, but they fail to invest in a term plan that could really, save their family a great deal of hardship should anything ever happen to you. These are things for incremental dollars that would just make all the difference long term for you. And then other areas of your insurance needs. This is just, again, an area I'm just kind of nudging you to take a look at these areas because they're often neglected in the budgeting process. If you have questions about this, it's simple. Pick up the phone, ask as many questions. We got a lot of folks at the credit union and partners who want to help you in this area, but align some of these areas that are overlooked into your budget. It will strengthen that broader financial plan. So just a couple quick thoughts here, and then we'll take some questions. Again, I really want you to go back, take a look at some of the behavioral economic principles that we laid out. Do that before you go down the path of trying to just put the numbers down on paper. Really think about yourself. How are you approaching money? Look at some of those questions that we presented earlier. And one of those that will certainly come up time and time again is to be realistic. Don't fall into the hyperbolic discounting and thinking things are rosy forever. Let's just get down to reality here. Where are we now and where do we want to go? And just do your best not to believe that everything is always going to be wonderful. That's why we plan and have insurance. That's why we do other elements of our financial plan. Just keep things realistic, okay? That's not easy to do. That's why we're talking about it as being one of the areas that causes us to fail. But the more we can remind ourselves of that, the better. Set a goal. Let's prioritize and align money and financial goals. Think about what that timeline looks like. Certainly through Trinity, I would love to work with you on a budget if that's what you need help of doing that type of work. And then whether it's credit or through the budgeting process or working with our partners, insurance and investments through the credit union or first-time home buyers, that's why we're here today, is to help you. So if you need some help structuring this and just want some advice on how to put this together, or even trying to figure out what your true money personality is, give me a call. I'll love to work with you. And that's why we're doing this work today. And then lastly, the more you can automate the process, whether you leverage payroll or the credit union tools, the better your outcomes are going to be. Okay. Again, I'm going to reiterate this point once again. The more engagement, the better the outcomes. Use the tools that are provided, whether it's through the budgeting process, whether it's a tracking app, GE money management tool. Those are the things, again, that can truly shift behavior and help you become successful. So that is a lot of information on your this Tuesday morning. So I want to thank you all again, and thank you so much for joining us. And in the remaining moments that we have, Kelly, I'll answer any questions. And thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you, Todd. So we will do Q&A with our time remaining. If you have any questions, go ahead and submit those. Again, if we don't get to every question, I will share them with Todd after to ensure that we get your answer to you within the next day or so. So let's go ahead and jump into it. The first question says, what is the best way to prioritize debts when creating a budget?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when we're prioritizing those debts, I like to prioritize for a whole range of reasons, but for motivation primarily. I like to prioritize not based on interest rate, but on dollar amount. Okay, so there's various approaches, and different planners will take a different approach on this. But for efficiency's sake and for motivation, I always prioritize around lowest dollar. We look for what I would say the low-hanging fruit. Some of the accounts that maybe are a smaller dollar, and then we kind of practice a rollover approach. So rank order from lowest to highest, and then we'll use the budgeting approach to accelerate the loan repayment on some of those smaller dollar loans that we may have, or smaller dollar cards. And we're kind of rolling that forward to kind of change our credit debt ratio and just improve our score. But just simply by prioritizing from lowest to highest dollar amount in terms of your card, and then working through the budget process, that in itself right there will have a lot of efficiency for you, and not only raise your credit score, but also show you that the process works and give you motivation to continue. And then we kind of work our way through that process longer term. But any questions on that, you have my contact information right here. I can walk you through that in finer detail if necessary, but rank order from lowest to highest, align a dollar amount, and then pay off.
This next question is asking, what apps or templates, if any, do you recommend to help me with budgeting?
Yeah, it's such a broad way to go about doing it at this point. I mean, there's everything from Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to I would say, first and foremost, we're on a call with the credit union today. So I would say first, what we would want to do, particularly when it comes to that GE money management tool, use your bank account, use the money management tool. There's the banking app through the credit union as well. So we want to use the tools that we have at hand. And then I don't have necessarily a budget that I particularly endorse necessarily, because there's so many different variations on that theme. I've used as a tracking app, I've used Toshel for many years, T-O-S-H-L, Toshel. But with the GE money management tool, you get so much more than what you would get from just the app itself. But this is a question where the reason I don't endorse a particular one or say this is where you should go, I would say more importantly, I would ask you to figure out how you might want to approach this topic. That's really what I tried to emphasize today. You know, sometimes we think that something like a budgeting app or something like that will be successful for us, and we find out that there's a learning curve, or it's more than what we anticipated to use the actual technology. So start simply. Just, you think about a budget. Certainly I can provide you a budget here at the office through Trinity. It's a very basic budget to get you started, but use the tools that you currently have at the credit union as your starting point. Everything that you need, the core work that you need, is right in your accounts and through the credit union. So let's just start there, as opposed to trying to look elsewhere. We basically have everything we need to start with the credit union to develop a broad financial plan.
And then let's go ahead and end on this question. It says, how do I budget for one-time expenses?
Well, one-time expenses can have a whole range of numbers behind it. We can be talking about a large expense, or it could be a major expense, or some other thing that we're talking about. The way I would approach that, again, I'm just going to assume that this one-time expense is maybe a larger purchase that maybe you're planning. Again, I take that planning concept very seriously. So I would say start with some type of account that you're moving money into that account, automate that process, move those funds into a separate savings. And then in addition to your, your fixed and variable expenses, which you're budgeting monthly regardless, now you've got this other bucket of funds that you've built. You got this separate account. So if you need to account or budget for that one item or have this one-time expense, that money's already sitting in one of my GE savings accounts, and I've got everything else that I need through my budget to meet my overall monthly expenses. So it's all about structure. So if you're going to budget around that one-time expense, let's set up a separate savings. Let's move money into that account and automate that process through time. And when that account needs to be pulled up and used, it's there and ready to go.
And speaking of those one-time expenses and maybe even emergency savings, that's going to take me into my closing comments. We do have some upcoming webinars, one of those being building an emergency savings before there's an emergency. So if any of these topics are of interest to you, you can visit our events page or capture the QR code with your smartphone that's there on the screen. That'll take you there directly. And we are in the process of getting our June webinars up as well. So there's definitely more to come. I just wanted to close out with that, say thank you so much, Todd, for taking us through today's content. In all of these budgeting aspects, there's a lot more than I think people kind of understand on the surface. So thanks for really taking us through and diving us into some of these concepts to help us better to understand budgeting. So just one last comment, there will be a survey upon exiting, so please just take a quick moment to fill that out. But that is all we have for you today. Thank you all so much for joining us and staying throughout the duration of the webinar. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.